I will not. You don't have a warrant. You have no right to search my belongings.
The subject is being uncooperative.
Sarah Jenkins believed in the quiet power of a classroom. For her. Room 21B at Northwood Community College wasn't just a physical space. It was a sanctuary. The air smelled of old books and dry erase markers, a scent she associated with curiosity and potential. At 42, with 15 years of teaching American literature under her belt, she had cultivated an environment where shy students found their voice and confident ones learned the humility of a well-crafted argument. Her passion wasn't just for the text, but for the act of discovery itself. She taught her students to dissect the works of Faulkner and Morrison not as historical artifacts, but as living documents that spoke to the complexities of the human heart. Her reputation on campus was sterling. She was the professor who held extra office hours, who wrote detailed feedback on every essay, and who remembered the names of her students years after they had graduated. She was firm but fair, demanding but compassionate. Her life was her work, a quiet, orderly existence built on the foundation of literature and mutual respect. That Tuesday morning was no different. The sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air as she guided her 10 a.m. class through the dense symbolism of a Flannery O'Connor short story. 23 adult students, a diverse mix of young people trying to find their path and older adults seeking a second chance, were engrossed. The discussion was lively, respectful. A young woman named Chloe was passionately arguing a point about grace and damnation, her voice filled with the thrill of intellectual engagement. Sarah listened, a small smile playing on her lips. This was why she taught. These moments of connection, of shared understanding, were the bedrock of her world. She felt a deep sense of peace, the kind that comes from knowing you are exactly where you are supposed to be, doing exactly what you were meant to do. She was so absorbed in the discussion that she didn't immediately notice the two figures standing in the open doorway. It was a student, a young man near the door, whose sudden shift in posture caught her eye. His focus had broken, his gaze fixed on something behind her. Sarah turned, her smile fading. Two police officers stood there, their dark blue uniforms a stark, jarring contrast to the warm, academic setting. They were an alien presence in her sanctuary, their polished leather and gleaming badges radiating an authority that had no place among books and ideas. One was older, heavier set, with a weary expression. The other, the one who stepped forward, was younger, maybe in his mid-30s, with a sharp, angular face and eyes that seemed to be assessing everything in the room as a potential threat. He moved with an unwarranted confidence, an alpha male swagger that felt performative and deeply unsettling. "Sarah Jenkins?" the younger officer asked. His voice was loud, cutting through the academic murmur like a shard of glass. It wasn't a question so much as a declaration. Every student in the room froze. The vibrant discussion died instantly, the silence that replaced it thick with confusion and a rising sense of dread. Sarah felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She had never had so much as a speeding ticket in her life. Her world was one of grammar, syntax, and literary theory, not police interventions. "Yes, I'm Sarah Jenkins," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "How can I help you, officers?" She took a step forward, instinctively trying to position herself between the officers and her students, a shepherdess protecting her flock from a threat she couldn't yet comprehend. The younger officer's eyes swept over her, a flicker of something she couldn't name, disdain, in his gaze. He didn't seem to see a respected educator. He saw a target. "We need you to come with us," he said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. The world tilted on its axis, The familiar scent of books was suddenly replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of fear. The faces of her students were a blur of shock and disbelief. This wasn't happening. Not here. Not in her classroom. Not in her life. But the cold, unwavering stare of the officer told her it was all too real. Her sanctuary had been breached, and the world outside, with its harsh, incomprehensible rules, had just stormed in. Officer Mark Thorne, a 34-year-old patrolman with 7 years on the force and a reputation for mistaking procedural shortcuts for decisive action, felt a familiar surge of adrenaline. He thrived on these moments of public confrontation. To him, a call wasn't just a task to be completed, it was a stage. Walking onto the Northwood Community College campus, he felt the eyes of students on him and his partner. Officer Dave Miller, a 20-year veteran just a few years from retirement. Miller followed a half-step behind, his expression impassive, a silent supporting actor in Thorne's recurring drama. Thorne had taken the call himself, a complaint filed just an hour earlier by a student claiming a professor was dealing drugs out of her classroom. The allegation was thin, based on a single, uncorroborated tip from a student with a history of disciplinary issues. A more cautious officer would have flagged it for a detective, initiated a discreet preliminary inquiry, or at the very least, spoken to the professor privately. But Thorne saw an opportunity for a high-profile, decisive arrest. It was clean, simple, and visible. He had already decided Sarah Jenkins was guilty. In his mind, the narrative was set. A teacher abusing her position of trust. A wolf in sheep's clothing. He had a particular disdain for what he called the ivory tower types. Academics he saw as smug, condescending, and disconnected from the real world he policed. This was a chance to bring one of them down a peg. "Room 21B," he said to Miller, his voice clipped and authoritative as they moved down the quiet academic hall. Miller just grunted in response. He'd seen Thorne operate like this before, a bulldog chasing a narrative, often ignoring evidence that contradicted it. Miller had learned long ago that it was easier to stay quiet and let Thorne take the lead than to challenge his gut feelings. It made for a peaceful shift, even if it sometimes left a sour taste in his mouth. When they reached the open door of room 21B, Thorne paused for a moment, taking in the scene. He saw the teacher, her back to him, engrossed with her students. He heard the intellectual chatter and felt a wave of irritation. It all felt so soft, so disconnected from the hard realities he dealt with. He stepped into the doorway, his presence a deliberate interruption, a hammer brought into a room of glass figurines. "Sarah Jenkins," he called out, his voice a calculated tool designed to command attention and assert dominance. The room fell silent, just as he knew it would. Every eye turned to him. Perfect. The professor turned, her expression shifting from academic engagement to bewildered concern. "Yes, I'm Sarah Jenkins," she said, her voice calm. "How can I help you, officers?" Thorne ignored her question. He wasn't there to be helped. He was there to enforce. He took another step into the room, his eyes doing a theatrical sweep, as if searching for hidden contraband in the bookshelves or under the students' desks. "We have a report of illegal activity taking place in this classroom," he announced, his voice projecting to every corner of the room. He was speaking not just to Sarah, but to her students, to her entire world. He was poisoning the well, ensuring that no matter what happened next, she would be judged. Sarah's face paled. "Illegal activity? Officer, I think there must be some kind of mistake. This is a literature class." Her attempt at reason was, in Thorne's view, a classic deflection. It was predictable. "We'll be the judge of that," he said, the corner of his mouth ticking up in a slight smirk. We need you to come with us. Now. He didn't offer to speak with her in the hallway. He didn't ask her to step outside. He chose the most public, most humiliating option available. And he did it by design. Miller shifted his weight by the door, his eyes avoiding the shocked faces of the students. He knew this was wrong. There was no probable cause for an arrest, no warrant, not even enough for a detention based on a single flimsy tip. This was pure theater, and Thorne was the director, writer, and star. But Miller remained silent. He watched as Sarah Jenkins, a woman whose entire life was contained within the walls of this room, tried to process the incomprehensible. She looked from Thorne's unyielding face to her students, their expressions a mixture of fear and confusion. She was losing control of her sanctuary, and Officer Thorne was just getting started. "Come with you where? For what reason?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly but laced with the firm logic of a seasoned educator. "You can't just walk into my classroom and—" Thorne cut her off, taking another deliberate step closer, invading her personal space. The scent of his leather duty belt was sharp and foreign. "I can and I am," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone that was somehow more frightening than his earlier shout. "We have a credible report that you are distributing controlled substances to students." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The accusation was so ludicrous, so disconnected from the reality of who she was, that for a moment, Sarah could only stare at him in stunned silence. Chloe, the student who had been speaking so passionately moments before, looked as if she'd been struck. The accusation hung in the air, thick and toxic, instantly transforming the atmosphere from one of intellectual curiosity to one of sordid criminality. This was Thorne's strategy: overwhelm with accusation, destabilize with public shame. He knew that the more shocking the charge, the less likely the target would be to mount an effective defense in the moment. "That's insane," Sarah finally managed to say, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Who would say such a thing? There is no evidence of that because it never happened." Thorne smiled, a cold, thin expression devoid of any warmth. "That's what they all say. Ma'am, you need to stop resisting and come with us now." He wasn't just arresting her, he was performing a character assassination in front of the very people whose respect she had spent years earning. He turned his head slightly, addressing the students who were now watching, frozen, some with their phones half raised. "I'm sure this is a shock to all of you," he said, his tone dripping with false sincerity. "But sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones hiding the biggest secrets." He was deliberately planting a seed of doubt, framing her as a master manipulator. He wanted her students to question everything they knew about her. He wanted to shatter the trust that was the foundation of her profession. "Officer, this is my classroom. These are my students. You are destroying my reputation based on a lie." Sarah pleaded, her composure finally beginning to crack. She looked at the faces of her students, seeing the confusion morphing into suspicion in some of their eyes. Miller, still standing by the door, felt a pang of something that might have been shame. He saw the professor's desperation, the palpable injustice of the moment. He saw Thorne enjoying it. His partner wasn't just making an arrest. He was relishing the power to dismantle a person's life with a few carefully chosen words. Yet, he said nothing. His silence was his complicity. "Empty your pockets, ma'am," Thorne commanded, his hand gesturing toward the tweed blazer she wore. "And your bag. Put it on the desk." "I will not," Sarah said, a spark of defiance flashing in her eyes. "You don't have a warrant. You have no right to search my belongings." Thorne's eyes narrowed. He had been hoping for this. Her defiance, born of innocence and principle, was exactly the resistance he needed to justify his next move. "Officer Miller," he said, without taking his eyes off Sarah. "The subject is being uncooperative." Miller sighed, a barely audible sound of resignation, and took a step forward. Sarah looked from one officer to the other, the reality of her powerlessness crashing down on her. There was no logic here, no room for debate or evidence. There was only the blunt instrument of Thorne's authority. "Don't do this," she whispered, a final, desperate plea. Thorne ignored her. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "You're under arrest for suspicion of distribution of a controlled substance," he said, his voice ringing with triumph. He spun her around, pulling her arms behind her back with a rough, practiced motion. The cold, metallic click of the handcuffs echoed in the dead, silent classroom. In that moment, her sanctuary of learning was irrevocably transformed into a crime scene, and she was no longer the respected professor. She was the accused, the guilty, the spectacle. The click of the handcuffs was a sound of finality. It severed the last thread of normalcy, plunging Sarah into a surreal nightmare. The cold steel bit into her wrists, a physical manifestation of her powerlessness. Thorne held her arm tightly, his knuckles pressing into her bicep. As he led her from behind her lectern, the place from which she had shared knowledge and inspired debate for years. Her students were statues, their faces a gallery of shock, horror, and a dawning, terrible confusion. She couldn't meet their eyes. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. This was where she had been a leader, a mentor. Now, she was a prisoner, a spectacle of disgrace being led away by a man who had judged and condemned her in less than 5 minutes. "Everybody stay in your seats," Thorne barked at the students as he steered Sarah toward the door. "We'll have campus security here shortly to take your statements." The threat was implicit. You are all witnesses, and your testimony matters. He was ensuring the gossip would have an official stamp. As they stepped out of room 21B and into the hallway, the scene widened. The commotion had drawn attention. Students and faculty members peered out of adjacent classrooms and offices, faces she recognized, colleagues she shared coffee with, students she had advised on their papers, were now staring, their expressions morphing from curiosity to astonishment as they saw her in handcuffs. Whispers started like a spark in dry grass, quickly catching fire and spreading down the corridor. "Is that Professor Jenkins? What did she do?" The questions swirled around her, each one a small, sharp cut. Thorne seemed to revel in the attention. He didn't take a discreet side exit or a service hallway. He chose the main artery of the building, leading her directly toward the central quad, the busiest part of campus at midday. It was a calculated act of theater, designed for maximum visibility. Officer Miller walked a few steps behind, his gaze fixed on the floor, a man trying to make himself invisible. He was a ghost in this drama, present but inconsequential. As they emerged from the academic building into the bright sunlight of the quad, the audience grew exponentially. Dozens, then hundreds of students were milling between classes, heads turned, conversations stopped, and then, inevitably, the phones came out. A sea of small black rectangles rose, their lenses all pointed at her. Each one was a tiny, unblinking eye, recording, documenting, and broadcasting her humiliation. The sound of clicking shutters and the soft whoosh of video recording filled the air. She could feel their gazes on her, dissecting her, her rumpled blazer, the tears welling in her eyes, the raw vulnerability of her cuffed hands behind her back. She was no longer Sarah Jenkins, the respected literature professor. She was a viral moment in the making, a piece of content to be shared, judged, and commented on. The walk across the quad to the distant parking lot where their patrol car was parked felt like an eternity. Every step was a fresh wave of mortification. She passed the library where she had spent countless hours. She passed the bench where she often ate her lunch. These familiar, comforting places were now just backdrop for her public degradation. Thorne kept his grip firm, his pace unhurried. He was parading his prize, a visible symbol of his authority. He wanted this image seared into the collective memory of the campus. He wanted everyone to see what happened when you challenged him. For Sarah, it was more than a walk. It was the complete and utter destruction of a life she had meticulously built. Her name, her career, her very identity were being dismantled in real time, one cell phone video at a time. By the time they reached the patrol car and Thorne roughly pushed her head down to guide her into the back seat, the damage was done. The doors of the car slammed shut, but the silence inside couldn't drown out the roar of her life collapsing around her. The sterile, windowless room at the precinct smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh, unflattering glare on the scuffed metal table bolted to the floor. The warmth and intellectual vibrancy of Sarah's classroom felt a universe away. This room was designed for one purpose: to strip away comfort and control, to make a person feel small and isolated. Thorne sat across from her, leaning forward with an air of practiced intensity. He had removed her handcuffs, but the red, chafed marks on her wrists were a constant reminder of her new reality. Miller stood in the corner, a silent fixture, his arms crossed over his chest. He was present, but his detachment was a statement in itself. "Let's start from the beginning. Sarah," Thorne began, using her first name to create a false sense of intimacy that was immediately repulsive. "Tell me about your arrangement. How long have you been selling pills to your students?" The question was a loaded weapon, presuming guilt as its starting point. There was no inquiry, only accusation. "I have never sold pills to my students or anyone else," Sarah stated, her voice shaking but firm. "This is a complete fabrication. You have no evidence because none exists." Thorne chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He picked up a thin file folder from the table and tapped it with his finger. It was completely empty, a prop for his performance. "We have a witness, a student, someone from your class who was brave enough to come forward. Are you saying they're lying?" "Yes," Sarah said without hesitation. "That's exactly what I'm saying." "Who is it? Who is making this accusation?" "We don't reveal our sources," Thorne said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "But their story is very detailed. They described you passing small packages to certain students in exchange for cash after class. Said it's been going on all semester. He was inventing details, weaving a narrative, trying to catch her in a lie or provoke an emotional reaction he could use against her. His entire investigation was built on a foundation of sand, and he was trying to bully her into making it solid. "That is a lie," Sarah repeated, her gaze unwavering. "My student records, my bank account, my entire life is an open book. You will find nothing because there is nothing to find. You arrested me in front of my entire world based on a fantasy." Miller shifted his weight in the corner. He knew this was a dangerous game. They had no corroboration, no physical evidence, no surveillance. They had a single, dubious statement. Standard procedure would be to gather more information before making an arrest, especially one so public. Thorne was operating in reverse, trying to build a case after the fact. "You seem angry, Sarah," Thorne observed, a predatory glint in his eye. "Innocent people are usually cooperative. They don't get defensive." "I am not being defensive. I am being violated," she shot back, her voice rising with righteous indignation. You humiliated me. You destroyed my professional standing, and now you're sitting here trying to psychologically manipulate me into confessing to a crime I didn't commit. This isn't an investigation, it's a witch hunt." Thorne's smirk faded, replaced by a flash of anger. His control was slipping. He stood up and began to pace the small room. "You think you're smart, don't you? With your big words and your fancy books, you think the rules don't apply to you? But in this room, I'm the one who asks the questions." He leaned down, placing his hands on the table and bringing his face close to hers. "We can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way. The hard way involves a search warrant for your home, your car, your office. We will tear your life apart piece by piece until we find what we're looking for. A little cooperation now will save you a lot of pain later." It was a bluff, a threat born of weakness. He knew a judge would be unlikely to grant a warrant based on their current evidence. He was counting on her not knowing that. But Sarah, though terrified, held on to the one thing he couldn't take from her, the truth. "Do what you have to do." "Officer," she said, her voice quiet but unbroken, "you are the one making a catastrophic mistake. Not me." Thorne stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight. He had expected tears, a confession, a collapse. He got resolve. He turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. For the first time, Miller spoke, his voice low. "He gets like this. Just be patient." It wasn't an apology, but it was an admission that the entire process was driven by one man's ego, not by the pursuit of justice. While Sarah was being subjected to Thorne's baseless interrogation, the shockwaves of her arrest were radiating through the administrative offices of Northwood Community College. Dean Alistair Reed, a meticulous man in his late 50s with a doctorate in history and a deep aversion to chaos, was in a budget meeting when his assistant burst in, her face pale. "Dean Reed, you need to see this," she said, holding out her phone. The screen showed a shaky, pixelated video. He saw the central quad, a crowd of students, and in the middle of it all, Sarah Jenkins, one of his most respected and beloved faculty members, being led in handcuffs toward a police car. A knot of ice formed in his stomach. He felt a dizzying sense of disbelief, followed by a surge of pure, unadulterated fury. "What in God's name is this?" he demanded, already on his feet. He spent the next 5 minutes piecing together the narrative from a dozen frantic phone calls and text messages. The police had walked into her class, accused her of dealing drugs, and arrested her in front of her students. There was no warning, no call to campus security, no professional courtesy extended to the college administration. They had treated his campus like a lawless street corner. Reed was not a man prone to rash action, but he recognized an institutional crisis when he saw one. This wasn't just about Sarah Jenkins, it was about the integrity and reputation of Northwood Community College. An arrest this public, based on an accusation this inflammatory, could do irreparable damage. He immediately ended the budget meeting and returned to his office, his mind racing. His first call was to the college's general counsel, a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer named Eleanor Vance. "Eleanor, we have a 5-alarm fire," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "The city police just arrested Sarah Jenkins. In her classroom, in the middle of a lecture. They paraded her across the quad in handcuffs. It's all over social media." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. "On what grounds?" Eleanor finally asked, her tone shifting from legal advisor to crisis manager. "The rumor mill says a drug accusation," Reed replied, the words tasting like poison. "It's patently absurd. This is Sarah Jenkins we're talking about. There has to be a mistake, but the damage is already being done. We need to get ahead of this, now." Eleanor's mind was already moving, processing liability, public relations, and legal strategy. "First, I'm calling the police chief's office directly," she said. "I want to know the arresting officers' names, the basis for the arrest, and Professor Jenkins's current status. This sounds procedurally unsound on every level." They had no right to create that kind of disruption without coordinating with campus security. Her second point was immediate. "We need to get Sarah legal representation, not just any lawyer, but the best criminal defense attorney we can find. The college will cover the cost. We have a duty to protect our faculty from this kind of egregious overreach." Reed felt a small measure of relief. The gears of the institution were beginning to turn. While he and Eleanor coordinated the legal response, the college's communications director was already drafting a statement, trying to frame a narrative that was spiraling out of their control. The campus was buzzing. Students were gathered in small, agitated groups, showing each other videos on their phones. The local news media, alerted by social media posts, had already dispatched a van, which was now parked at the main entrance to the campus. The story was breaking, and the first version was the one told by the dramatic images of a handcuffed professor. The truth was secondary. Dean Reed looked out his window at the news van. He felt a profound sense of institutional violation. Officer Thorne, in his arrogant pursuit of a dramatic arrest, had not just targeted a single woman, he had picked a fight with an entire institution, one that had the resources, the legal firepower, and the righteous anger to fight back. Reed called the head of campus security. "Get me the name of the student who made the complaint," he ordered. "I want to know everything about them. Their academic record, their disciplinary history, everything." The institution was awake now, and it was beginning to gather its weapons. The police department, and Officer Thorne in particular, had no idea what was about to hit them. The official report of the arrest landed on Lieutenant Isabella Rossi's desk with a dull thud. As the watch commander for the afternoon shift, Rossi was responsible for reviewing all significant incidents from the first half of the day. She was a 25-year veteran of the force, a woman who had seen it all and had developed an almost supernatural instinct for spotting trouble before it metastasized. She was known for her meticulous, by-the-book approach and had little patience for officers who valued drama over procedure. She picked up the file, her eyes scanning the summary. "Arrest of a college professor on campus for suspicion of narcotics distribution." Her eyebrows shot up. That alone was unusual. Arresting a professional in their place of work was always a delicate matter, reserved for situations where the suspect was a clear and present danger or a flight risk. Then she saw the name of the arresting officer, Mark Thorne. A familiar sense of unease settled over her. Thorne. He was one of her frequent flyers, an officer whose reports often required extra scrutiny. He had a history of escalating minor situations, of writing reports that painted his own actions in the most heroic light possible, while conveniently omitting details that might suggest otherwise. He saw himself as a crusader, but Rossi saw him as a liability, a lawsuit waiting to happen. She opened the folder and began to read Thorne's narrative. The language was confident, declarative. It described receiving a credible tip from a confidential informant about the professor. It detailed how the professor became argumentative and uncooperative upon initial contact, thereby necessitating her immediate detention to prevent the destruction of evidence. Rossi's eyes narrowed. The phrasing was all wrong. A student with a grudge wasn't a confidential informant. A person asking why they were being detained wasn't being uncooperative. Thorne was using police jargon to build a justification for a rash decision. She picked up the phone and dialed the front desk sergeant. "Get me Officer Miller," she said. "Have him come to my office. Now." A few minutes later, Dave Miller stood before her desk. His shoulders slumped, his gaze avoiding hers. Rossi had known Miller for 2 decades. He was a decent, if passive, officer. "Dave," she said, her voice even but firm, "walk me through the arrest of Professor Jenkins at the community college this morning." Miller shifted his feet, recounting the events in a flat, dispassionate monotone. He described the thinness of the initial complaint, Thorne's insistence on confronting the professor in her classroom, and the public arrest. He left out his own internal misgivings, but Rossi could hear them in the empty spaces between his words. "Was the professor a physical threat to you, your partner, or any of the students?" Rossi asked. "No, Lieutenant." "Was she a flight risk? Was there any indication she was about to flee the state?" "No, Lieutenant." "Was there any physical evidence of a crime? Did you see any drugs, any cash transactions, anything at all to corroborate the student's story before you put her in handcuffs?" Miller hesitated. "No, Lieutenant. Thorne said we had to move fast to—" Rossi held up a hand, cutting him off. "I've read what Thorne said. I'm asking you what you saw, and you saw nothing." Her voice was cold. "You saw a man with a badge and a gun humiliate a civilian in her place of work with zero probable cause, and you stood there and let it happen." Miller's face flushed with shame. "He's the lead officer on the call. Lieutenant, it was his play. It's always his play. Dave. And one of these days, a play like this is going to cost this department millions of dollars and burn whatever trust we have left with the community to the ground." She dismissed him with a wave of her hand. Her mind was already 3 steps ahead. The first thing she did was put a hold on Sarah Jenkins' processing. "She's not to be booked or transferred to county lockup until I speak with her," she told the desk sergeant. Second, she pulled the digital file for the body camera footage from both Thorne and Miller. She wanted to see exactly what happened, to hear every word that was said. Third, she placed a call to the chief's office. "Chief, this is Rossi. We may have a serious problem with an arrest made by Officer Thorne this morning at the community college. The circumstances look highly irregular." Lieutenant Rossi knew Thorne had not just arrested a professor. He had kicked a hornet's nest. The college would have lawyers. The professor, if innocent, would have a massive civil rights claim. And the whole thing had been filmed by dozens of students. The digital evidence would be everywhere. She looked at the empty file on her desk, the one Thorne had used as a prop in the interrogation room. This wasn't just a bad arrest. It was a catastrophic failure of judgment, and it was now her job to contain the explosion. After nearly 4 hours in the cold, sterile interrogation room, the door opened. It wasn't Thorne. It was a woman in a lieutenant's uniform, her expression serious and unreadable. This was Isabella Rossi. "Professor Jenkins," she said, her tone professional and devoid of the condescension Sarah had endured from Thorne. "My name is Lieutenant Rossi. You're being released. There will be no charges filed at this time." The words hung in the air, a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Relief washed over Sarah so intensely it almost brought her to her knees. It was over. The nightmare was over. But as she stood up on unsteady legs, Rossi's next words erased any sense of victory. "A patrol car will give you a courtesy ride back to the campus to retrieve your vehicle. We've already been in contact with your college's legal counsel." The mention of lawyers was a stark reminder that this was far from over. She may have been cleared of the criminal accusation, but the public execution of her character was complete. She was escorted out through a back hallway, a small mercy that allowed her to avoid seeing Thorne again. She was handed her purse and her phone, which had been powered off. As she turned it on, it buzzed incessantly, a frantic, angry vibration. Hundreds of notifications flooded the screen. missed calls from family, friends, and colleagues, text messages filled with concern and confusion, and news alerts with her name in the headline. The courtesy ride back to campus was silent. The officer driving said nothing, and Sarah was lost in a fog of shock and dread. As they pulled up to the faculty parking lot, the true scope of her new reality hit her with the force of a physical blow. A local news van was still there, a reporter and a cameraman standing near the entrance, hoping for a quote. Worse, as she got out of the patrol car, a student walking by recognized her. His eyes widened, and he immediately started whispering to his friends, pointing his phone in her direction. She was no longer anonymous. She was infamous. The patrol car sped away, leaving her standing alone in the parking lot, the object of intense, unwelcome scrutiny. She fumbled for her car keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fit the key in the lock. Once inside her car, she locked the doors and leaned her forehead against the steering wheel, finally allowing the tears to come, not tears of relief, but of profound, gut-wrenching despair. She had been released from a physical cell only to be trapped in a much larger, more insidious prison of public opinion. Her phone buzzed again. It was her sister from out of state. "Sarah, what is going on? I saw a video online. They said you were arrested for drugs. Tell me it's not true." She had to explain, over and over to her family and closest friends, that it was a lie, a horrible mistake. But how could she explain that to the thousands of students, parents, and community members who had seen the video? The image of her in handcuffs was the only evidence they had, and it was damning. When she finally mustered the strength to drive home, the nightmare followed her. As she pulled into her quiet suburban neighborhood, she saw a car she didn't recognize parked across the street. A man with a camera sat inside. The media had found her address. Her home, her final refuge, was now under siege. She ran from her car to her front door, her head down, feeling like a fugitive. Inside, she drew all the blinds, plunging the house into a dim twilight. The silence was deafening. She was a ghost in her own life. She thought of her classroom, her sanctuary, now tainted. How could she ever stand in front of a class again? How could she command respect when her students had seen her so utterly humiliated? Thorne's investigation had lasted a few hours. Rossi had dismantled it in minutes. But the damage Thorne had inflicted in his quest for a dramatic arrest would last a lifetime. He hadn't just taken her freedom for a few hours. He had stolen her name, her peace, and the simple joy of a life she had loved. She was innocent. She was free. But she had never felt more imprisoned. Lieutenant Rossi didn't believe in coincidences, and she certainly didn't believe in unsubstantiated, life-altering accusations. While Sarah Jenkins was being released, Rossi was already digging into the source of the complaint. The confidential informant Thorne had so dramatically cited was, as she suspected, nothing of the sort. The name on the initial report was Olivia Morgan. A quick search of the college's records, provided with full cooperation by a furious Dean Reed, painted a clear picture. Olivia Morgan, 23, was a student in Sarah Jenkins's 10 a.m. literature class. Her academic performance was mediocre at best, but her disciplinary record was more notable. She had been formally warned twice for plagiarism and had a documented history of being disruptive and argumentative with several professors, including Jenkins. The motive was beginning to crystallize. Rossi found an email exchange from 2 weeks prior. Olivia had vehemently disputed a failing grade she received on a major essay, an essay Sarah had meticulously documented as being largely copied from an online source. Sarah's emails were professional and firm, explaining the college's academic integrity policy and offering to meet with Olivia to discuss it. Olivia's replies grew increasingly hostile and personal, culminating in a threat. You'll be sorry you did this to me. People like you always get what's coming to them. It was the smoking gun. This wasn't a concerned student reporting a crime. It was a disgruntled student seeking revenge. Rossi requested that campus security locate Olivia Morgan and ask her to come to the station to provide a formal, recorded statement. She wasn't a suspect, Rossi explained, but a key witness whose information needed to be clarified. Olivia arrived an hour later, swaggering with an unearned sense of importance. She clearly believed she was the hero of this story. Rossi led her not to an interrogation room, but to a small, quiet office. She offered her a bottle of water and began the interview in a calm, conversational tone. "Olivia, thank you for coming in," Rossi began. "I just want to go over the information you provided to Officer Thorne this morning. Tell me again, in your own words, what you saw." Olivia launched into her story, her voice filled with dramatic flair. She described seeing Professor Jenkins discreetly, passing little white envelopes to certain students after class. She claimed to have seen cash being exchanged. "It was always the same students," Olivia said, her eyes wide with feigned sincerity. "She was so sneaky about it." Rossi listened patiently, taking notes. "Okay. Can you give me the names of these students? The ones who received the envelopes?" Olivia hesitated, her confidence faltering for the first time. I don't know their names. I just see them in class." "What did they look like?" Rossi pressed gently. Olivia provided a vague, generic description that could have fit half the students in the class. "You said you saw cash being exchanged," Rossi continued. "What denominations? Were they 10s, 20s, 50s? I couldn't see exactly," Olivia stammered. "It was fast. And the envelopes. You said they were white. What size were they? Business size? Small? Like a coin envelope?" Olivia's story began to change. The envelopes were sometimes manila, not white. The cash exchange she hadn't seen directly, but she assumed it's what was happening. Rossi let her talk, letting her weave a web of contradictions. Then, Rossi changed tactics. She slid a copy of the email exchange between Olivia and Sarah across the table. "Olivia, is this your email address?" she asked, her voice hardening slightly. Olivia looked down at the printed pages, and the color drained from her face. She saw her own hostile words, her own threats. The trap had been sprung. "You failed her class. You were caught plagiarizing. And you threatened her," Rossi said, her voice now cold and sharp as steel. "And 2 weeks later, you file a report accusing her of being a drug dealer. Do you see how that looks?" Olivia was silent, her earlier bravado completely gone. "Filing a false police report is a serious crime. Olivia," Rossi continued, her voice relentless. "Officer Thorne took your lie and used it to destroy a woman's reputation today. Your lie led to her being handcuffed in front of her students. Your lie is now the subject of a major internal investigation and a likely federal lawsuit. This has gone far beyond a simple grudge." Olivia began to cry, the manipulative, crocodile tears of someone who had been caught. "I didn't think it would go this far," she whimpered. "I was just angry. I wanted her to get in trouble." Rossi stared at her, her expression a mixture of pity and contempt. "Well, she did," Rossi said, standing up. "And now, so are you." The foundation of the arrest hadn't just crumbled, it had been exposed as a malicious, petty lie. And now, the focus of the investigation would shift dramatically, from the innocent victim to the vengeful accuser and the reckless officer who had been all too willing to believe her. With Olivia Morgan's tearful confession, the internal gears of the police department began to grind with terrifying efficiency. Lieutenant Rossi personally briefed the chief of police and the head of the Internal Affairs Division, IAD. The meeting was short and grim. The body camera footage had already been reviewed, and it was even more damning than Rossi's summary. It captured Thorne's aggressive, dismissive tone, his public pronouncements of guilt, and Sarah Jenkins's calm, reasoned attempts to de-escalate a situation he seemed determined to ignite. It was a textbook case of an officer creating a crisis where none existed. The chief, a man whose political survival depended on avoiding just this kind of public relations catastrophe, made his orders clear. Open a formal IAD investigation into Thorne and Miller, effective immediately. I want them on administrative leave by the end of the day. Pull their badges and their firearms. I want a full review of Thorne's case history for the last 2 years. Look for a pattern. The hunters had officially become the hunted. Officer Mark Thorne was at home, still riding the high of his big arrest, when the call came from his union representative. IAD is opening a formal investigation. Mark, they're putting you on the beach. Don't talk to anyone. Thorne was stunned. For what? I made a good arrest. The suspect was uncooperative. The suspect was released with no charges, the rep replied, his voice heavy. And the informant has recanted. She admitted she lied. This is bad. Mark, really bad. The confidence drained out of Thorne in a cold rush. He had been so sure of his narrative, so certain of his own instincts, that he had never considered the possibility that he was catastrophically wrong. He thought back to the interrogation, to Sarah Jenkins's unwavering resolve. He had mistaken her innocence for arrogance. At the station, 2 stone-faced investigators from Internal Affairs met with Officer Miller. The tone was no longer collegial. They were not his brothers in blue. They were his inquisitors. Officer Miller, the lead investigator began, you were present during the detention and arrest of Ms. Sarah Jenkins. Your body camera was active. In your professional opinion, did Officer Thorne have sufficient probable cause to make a custodial arrest at that time? Miller was trapped. Lying to IAD was a career-ending offense. Telling the truth meant throwing his partner under the bus. He swallowed hard. Based on the information we had at the time, it was a thin complaint, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Did you, at any point, suggest to Officer Thorne that he should de-escalate? That he should speak to the professor privately? That handcuffing her in front of a crowd of students might be a procedural misstep? The questions were relentless, each one highlighting his own passivity, his own failure to intervene. No, Miller said, the word hanging in the air like a confession. I did not. He was cited for failure to intervene, a serious breach of department policy. His silent complicity had made him an accomplice in the eyes of the department. The IAD review of Thorne's past cases quickly revealed the pattern the chief had feared. Thorne had a history of favoring high drama, low evidence arrests. There were a half-dozen prior complaints from civilians for aggressive behavior and jumping to conclusions, all of which had been dismissed at a preliminary stage by a friendly supervisor. He consistently chose confrontation over conversation, escalation over de-escalation. He wasn't a corrupt cop in the traditional sense. He wasn't taking bribes or planting evidence. He was something almost as dangerous, an officer so blinded by his own ego and a self-styled crusader complex that he had lost the ability to be objective. He saw every interaction as a battle to be won, not a situation to be resolved. The IAD report, when it was completed, was brutal. It concluded that Officer Thorne had acted with gross negligence, had violated Sarah Jenkins's civil rights, had demonstrated clear bias and a lack of professional judgment, and had brought the department into disrepute. It recommended his immediate termination. Officer Miller's fate was sealed as well. His failure to act, his silent endorsement of Thorne's recklessness, was deemed unforgivable. The report recommended a lengthy suspension and a permanent mark on his record that would effectively kill any chance of promotion or a desirable assignment. The system, once weaponized so effectively by Thorne, had now turned its full, dispassionate force upon him and his partner. Sarah Jenkins spent the first 48 hours after her release in a state of suspended animation. She didn't answer her phone, didn't watch the news, and didn't leave her house. The drawn blinds were a physical barrier against a world that now felt hostile and judgmental. Her carefully constructed life was in ruins. The college had placed her on paid administrative leave, a gesture they intended as supportive, but which felt like a quarantine. She was too radioactive to be in a classroom. Her name, once synonymous with academic integrity, was now linked in perpetuity with a sordid, false accusation. The shame was a constant, suffocating presence. She felt like an imposter in her own skin. On the third day, a call came through that she finally answered. It was Eleanor Vance, the college's general counsel. "Sarah," Eleanor said, her voice warm but businesslike. "I know this is an incredibly difficult time. The college stands with you, and we are going to ensure you have the resources to fight back. We have arranged a consultation for you with a civil rights attorney. His name is Benjamin Carter. He's the best there is. Will you meet with him?" Sarah was hesitant. The thought of reliving the experience, of dissecting every moment of her humiliation, was agonizing. But a flicker of the defiance she had shown in the interrogation room rekindled within her. She was a victim, but she refused to be defined by her victimhood. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I'll meet with him." Benjamin Carter's office was not the opulent, wood-paneled cliché of a high-powered law firm. It was a functional, modern space filled with books and case files, the war room of a legal strategist. Carter himself was in his early 50s, with a calm, reassuring demeanor that concealed a razor-sharp legal mind. He had made a career out of holding powerful institutions accountable, particularly law enforcement agencies that had abused their authority. He listened intently as Sarah recounted her story, his expression growing more serious with each detail. He didn't interrupt. He let her speak, understanding that the act of telling her story, of being heard and believed, was itself a form of healing. When she finished, her voice thick with emotion, he looked at the file Eleanor Vance had sent over, which included the names of the officers and a preliminary report from the college. "Sarah," he began, his voice filled with a quiet intensity, "what happened to you was not a mistake. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a catastrophic failure of policing, driven by one officer's ego and another's cowardice. It was a violation of your Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable seizure and a violation of your 14th Amendment right to due process." He leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. "They didn't just arrest you. They intentionally and maliciously destroyed your reputation. They used the power of their badge to conduct a public execution of your character with no evidence. This is not just a case of negligence. This is a case of malice." For the first time in days, Sarah felt a surge of something other than shame or despair. It was anger, cold and clear. Carter was giving her pain a name, a legal framework. He was turning her trauma into a cause of action. "The body camera footage will be our primary weapon," Carter continued, his mind already outlining the lawsuit. "Thorne's own words will condemn him. The student's recanted testimony will obliterate any claim of probable cause. The department's failure to discipline Thorne for prior complaints will establish a pattern of deliberate indifference. We are not just going to sue the officers, we are going to sue the department and the city for failing to train and supervise their officers properly." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "This will be a difficult and public fight. They will try to dig into your life. to find anything they can use to discredit you. But I believe a jury will see exactly what happened here. And we will not ask for an apology. We will ask for a number so large that it forces them to change the way they operate, so that what happened to you never happens to anyone else. In that moment, Sarah Jenkins made a decision. She would not hide. She would not let them break her. With Benjamin Carter as her counsel, she would take the ruins of her life and forge them into a weapon for justice, for accountability, and for her own reclamation. The lawsuit would be her response, her testament, and her victory. Benjamin Carter moved with the speed and precision of a military commander launching a meticulously planned assault. Less than a month after his initial meeting with Sarah, his team filed a lawsuit in federal court. The document was a masterpiece of legal prose, a narrative that was both emotionally compelling and legally devastating. It named Officer Mark Thorne, Officer Dave Miller, the chief of police, and the city itself as defendants. The lawsuit alleged a litany of civil rights violations, false arrest, malicious prosecution, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and a Monell claim against the city, arguing that the officers' actions were the result of a systemic failure in training and supervision, an official policy or custom of indifference. The centerpiece of the lawsuit was the demand for damages, $15 million. It was a figure designed to shock, to grab headlines, and to signal that this would not be a case that could be quietly settled for a nuisance fee. Carter held a press conference on the steps of the federal courthouse the day the suit was filed, with a composed and dignified Sarah Jenkins standing by his side. He laid out their case to a throng of reporters. Today, we are seeking justice for Professor Sarah Jenkins, a dedicated educator whose life was shattered by the reckless and malicious actions of officers who swore an oath to protect her, Carter began, his voice resonating with authority. This was not a mistake made in the heat of the moment. This was a calculated act of public humiliation based on a lie that the most basic police work would have exposed. Officer Thorne chose theater over investigation. Officer Miller chose silence over his duty to intervene. And the city chose to ignore a pattern of misconduct until it resulted in this tragedy. He didn't allow Sarah to speak, protecting her from the media circus. But her presence alone was a powerful statement. She was not a shadowy accuser. She was a real person whose life had been upended. The story exploded across local and even national news outlets. The narrative was irresistible. A beloved teacher, a false accusation, and a dramatic video of her walk of shame. The city's administration was thrown into a panic. The city attorney's office, initially dismissive, now realized they were facing a legal and public relations nightmare of the highest order. They had Thorne's damning body camera footage, Olivia Morgan's sworn affidavit admitting she lied, and now one of the top civil rights attorneys in the state leading the charge. The lawsuit immediately changed the dynamic within the city government. The police department, which had been conducting its own slow-moving internal investigation, was now under immense pressure from the mayor's office. The city council demanded answers. The police chief, who had hoped to handle the matter internally, was now forced to issue a public statement acknowledging the serious nature of the allegations. Thorne and Miller, who had been on paid leave, were immediately moved to unpaid suspension pending the outcome of the lawsuit and the IAD investigation. The legal filing had turned a departmental problem into a full-blown civic crisis. It forced the city to choose sides, and defending Thorne's actions was becoming increasingly untenable. For Sarah, the lawsuit was both terrifying and empowering. Her name and face were everywhere again, but this time, the narrative was different. She was no longer just the accused professor. She was the plaintiff, the one fighting back. Messages of support began to pour in from former students, colleagues, and strangers from around the country who had been moved by her story. The lawsuit gave a structure to her pain, a purpose to her suffering. It was a formal declaration that she would not be erased or silenced. Benjamin Carter had known the impact the filing would have. A lawsuit is more than a legal document. It is a public declaration of war. By filing in federal court and demanding a jury trial, he had taken the case out of the hands of local politics and placed it before the conscience of the community. He had turned Sarah's personal trauma into a public referendum on the conduct of its police force. And it was a battle the city was not prepared to fight. The lawsuit had been filed, the lines had been drawn, and the city was about to learn a very expensive lesson about accountability. The discovery phase of a lawsuit is where the real war is fought. Far from the dramatic theater of the courtroom, it is a grueling process of exchanging documents, taking depositions, and unearthing the evidence that lies buried in file cabinets and digital servers. For Benjamin Carter and his team, it was a hunt. And their primary target was the service record of Officer Mark Thorne. The city's lawyers fought them at every turn, filing motions to quash subpoenas and limit the scope of discovery. They argued that Thorne's past conduct was irrelevant to the Jenkins case. Carter argued the opposite, that Thorne's past was not just relevant, but was the very heart of their claim against the city. After a series of heated legal battles, the federal judge agreed with Carter, ordering the city to produce Thorne's complete, unredacted personnel file. What they received was a bombshell. The file was a damning indictment not just of one officer, but of an entire system that enabled him. Carter's team found 6 separate civilian complaints filed against Thorne over the preceding 4 years. Each one told a similar story. An officer who was quick to escalate, who was verbally aggressive, and who seemed to make arrests based on a predetermined narrative rather than emerging facts. There was a complaint from a motorist who was pulled from his car and handcuffed for being argumentative during a routine traffic stop. There was another from a shop owner who was threatened with arrest for questioning Thorne's handling of a suspected shoplifter. In every single case, the pattern was the same. Thorne initiated a confrontation, interpreted any questioning of his authority as resistance, and used that resistance to justify an arrest or the use of force. And in every single case, the complaint had been investigated by Thorne's direct supervisor, a sergeant who was a close friend, and dismissed as unfounded or exonerated. No disciplinary action was ever taken. No retraining was ever ordered. The department had been repeatedly warned about this officer's behavior and had chosen to do nothing. This was the pattern of neglect Carter needed for his Monell claim against the city. He could now argue that Thorne wasn't just a bad apple, he was the predictable product of a department that tolerated and implicitly encouraged his brand of aggressive, ego-driven policing. The depositions were even more devastating. Carter put Thorne on the stand for a grueling 8-hour session, under the cold, fluorescent lights of a conference room, and without the protection of his badge or the familiar dynamics of a street encounter. Thorne's confidence crumbled. Carter methodically walked him through the events of Sarah's arrest. "Officer Thorne, at the moment you put Professor Jenkins in handcuffs, what physical evidence did you possess that she had committed a crime?" "I had the statement from the informant," Thorne said, his voice defensive. "The informant, who was a failing student with a documented grudge against the professor?" Carter countered. "Did you make any attempt to verify her story before making the arrest?" "We had to act quickly to secure the scene." "Secure the scene from what, officer? A literature discussion?" Carter then deposed Thorne's supervisor, the one who had cleared him on 6 prior occasions. Under oath, the sergeant was forced to admit that his investigations consisted of little more than asking Thorne for his side of the story and accepting it at face value. Finally, they deposed Officer Miller, on the stand, away from Thorne's intimidating presence. Miller's quiet guilt finally found its voice. Carter asked him a simple question. "Officer Miller, in your heart, did you believe Professor Jenkins was a drug dealer?" Miller hesitated, his eyes cast down at the conference table. "No," he said, his voice barely audible. "I did not." The admission was stunning. It was a direct contradiction of the department's entire defense. One of the arresting officers admitted, under oath, that he never believed the suspect was guilty. The pieces were all falling into place. Carter had the video, the false accuser's confession, the pattern of prior misconduct, and now, the partner's admission. The city's lawyers knew they were facing a disaster. They made a settlement offer, $750,000. Carter and Sarah rejected it without a second thought. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about a public accounting. It was about a jury. The courtroom was packed, a silent, tense arena where Sarah Jenkins's public life would be either permanently destroyed or finally redeemed. For over a year, she had lived in a state of limbo, her career on hold, her name forever associated with a crime she didn't commit. Now, it all came down to this. Dressed in a simple, professional gray suit, she walked to the witness stand, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every eye in the room was on her. The jury, the city's lawyers, the reporters in the press gallery, and across the room, Mark Thorne, who sat at the defendant's table, his face a mask of defiant resentment. Benjamin Carter approached the stand, his demeanor calm and reassuring. He began not with the arrest, but with her life before it. He asked her about her love for literature, her passion for teaching, and her relationship with her students. His questions were designed to paint a portrait of the woman Thorne had tried to erase, a dedicated, respected professional whose classroom was her life's work. Sarah's voice, though initially trembling, grew stronger as she spoke about her work. She described the joy of seeing a student grasp a complex idea, the satisfaction of helping someone find their own voice through the written word. The jury saw not a criminal, but a teacher, a good one. Then, Carter shifted his questioning to the day of the arrest. "Professor Jenkins," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "can you tell the jury, in your own words, what happened on the morning of October 12th? Sarah took a deep breath and began to recount the nightmare. She described the sudden appearance of the officers, the shock of the baseless accusation, and Thorne's immediate, unprovoked hostility. She spoke of the utter helplessness she felt as her sanctuary was invaded. "He didn't ask questions. He made accusations," she said, her voice clear and steady. "He wasn't there to investigate. He was there to condemn." Carter then played the body camera footage on the large screens in the courtroom. The jury watched in stunned silence. They saw Thorne's swagger, heard his dismissive tone, and witnessed his deliberate act of public humiliation. Then they saw the footage from the students' cell phones, a chaotic, multi-angle view of her walk of shame across the quad. The jury saw her face, etched with a pain and mortification that no actor could fake. The city's attorney rose for the cross-examination, his job to poke holes in her testimony, to paint her as uncooperative or dishonest. He tried to frame her questions to Thorne as resistance. "Professor Jenkins, isn't it true that you refused to cooperate with the officer's investigation?" "I refused to be searched without a warrant," Sarah corrected him calmly. "I asked why I was being accused of something so monstrous. Is that resistance? Or is that a right any citizen has?" He tried to suggest she had somehow provoked Thorne's reaction. "Officer Thorne is an experienced officer. What did you do to make him feel that such a forceful arrest was necessary?" The question backfired. Sarah looked directly at the jury, her eyes welling with tears but her voice unbroken. "I did nothing," she said, her voice ringing with the simple, powerful truth. I was teaching a class. I was doing my job. I existed. For Officer Thorne, on that day, that was enough. The courtroom was utterly silent. The jurors' faces were a mixture of sympathy and a dawning anger. They were not just hearing a story. They were bearing witness to a profound injustice. In that moment, Sarah Jenkins ceased to be the plaintiff in a lawsuit. She became the embodiment of every person who had ever been wronged by someone in a position of power. Every individual who had been judged unfairly and condemned without cause. Her testimony was not just a recounting of events. It was a powerful indictment of a system that had failed her. And her quiet dignity on the stand had just sealed the city's fate. Benjamin Carter's closing argument was not a speech. It was a reckoning. He stood before the jury, not with fiery theatrics, but with the cold, hard weight of undeniable fact. He walked them back through every piece of evidence, every lie, every procedural failure. He held up the IAD report with its conclusion of gross negligence. He played the damning clip from Officer Miller's deposition, where he admitted he never believed Sarah was guilty. And he repeatedly returned to the image from the body camera, Thorne's smirk as he announced the arrest, a man reveling in his power to destroy. "This was never about a crime," Carter said, his voice low and powerful, his gaze sweeping across the jury box. "This was about power. It was about the arrogance of one officer who believed his badge gave him the right to be judge, jury, and executioner in a sunlit classroom on a Tuesday morning. And it was about the cowardice of a system that looked the other way, time and time again, until it was too late." He then turned his attention to Sarah. "They took more than her freedom for a few hours," he said. "They took her name. They took her sanctuary. They took the trust she had spent a lifetime building with her students and her community. They left a scar that will never fully heal. Your verdict today cannot erase that scar, but it can send a message. It can roar through the halls of City Hall and the police department. A message that this is not acceptable. A message that accountability is not optional. A message that in this country, a badge is not a crown." When the city's attorney gave his closing, his argument was weak and defensive. He tried to portray Thorne as a diligent officer acting on what he believed to be credible information, but the words rang hollow. The evidence was too overwhelming. Sarah's testimony too powerful. The jury had already made up its mind. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When the foreperson, a middle-aged woman who had watched Sarah's testimony with tears in her eyes, handed the verdict slip to the bailiff, the courtroom held its breath. The clerk's voice was clear and steady as she read the verdict. "On the count of false arrest, we the jury find for the plaintiff, Sarah Jenkins." A quiet gasp went through the courtroom. "On the count of malicious prosecution, we find for the plaintiff. On the count of intentional infliction of emotional distress, we find for the plaintiff. On the count of municipal liability for failure to train and supervise, we find for the plaintiff." They had won on every single count, but the final part of the verdict was the one that would echo for years to come. The clerk cleared her throat. "We award the plaintiff, Sarah Jenkins, compensatory damages in the amount of $400,000 for emotional distress and damage to her reputation. And we award punitive damages to be paid by the city and the individual officers in the amount of $10 million. The number was a thunderclap, $10.4 million. It was a stunning, breathtaking roar for justice. Sarah Jenkins broke down, burying her face in her hands as sobs of relief and vindication shook her entire body. Ben Carter placed a hand on her shoulder, his own eyes shining. Across the room, Mark Thorne sat as if turned to stone, his face pale, his career and future utterly annihilated by the weight of that number. His arrogance had come with a price tag, and a jury of 12 ordinary citizens had just handed him the bill. The verdict was more than just money. It was a public declaration of truth. It was a formal, legally binding statement that Sarah Jenkins was innocent, that she had been profoundly wronged, and that those responsible would be held accountable in the most unequivocal way possible. The jury's decision was a fire bell in the night for the city, a permanent and costly monument to the consequences of unchecked power and institutional neglect. The verdict was a conclusion, but it was not an ending. For Sarah Jenkins, the $10.4 million judgment was a public vindication, a legal restoration of her good name. But justice and healing are two different things. In the quiet months that followed the trial, as the news cycle moved on and the city begrudgingly processed the payment, Sarah was left to navigate the wreckage. She returned to her position at the college, welcomed back by colleagues and a supportive administration, but the classroom, once her sanctuary, now felt different. The ghost of that day lingered. She would sometimes look at the doorway and feel a phantom chill, a flicker of the terror she felt when Thorne and Miller first appeared. The trust that had once come so easily between her and her students was now something she had to consciously rebuild. She knew most of them supported her, but she could still feel the weight of the accusation, a shadow that followed her down the academic halls. The consequences for the other actors in the drama were swift and permanent. Officer Mark Thorne was terminated from the police force. The massive judgment against him personally, though mostly covered by the city's indemnity, forced him into bankruptcy. His law enforcement certification was permanently revoked, barring him from ever wearing a badge in the state again. He became a pariah, his name synonymous with police misconduct. Officer Dave Miller, cited for his failure to intervene, accepted a deal that allowed him to retire early, his 20-year career ending not with a commendation, but with a quiet, shameful exit. Olivia Morgan, the student whose lie had started it all, was expelled from the college and faced criminal charges for filing a false police report. She received a sentence of probation and community service. A slap on the wrist that felt wholly inadequate to Sarah, but was a permanent stain on her own young life. The verdict sent shockwaves through the city's police department. The chief resigned. A federal oversight program was implemented, mandating sweeping reforms in training, supervision, and the handling of civilian complaints. The Thorne Protocol, as it became known internally, was a new directive that strictly limited on-site arrests of professionals in their workplaces without supervisory approval and overwhelming probable cause. A single photograph from a student's phone of Sarah in handcuffs, head bowed, was now used in training academies across the state as a case study in what not to do. It was a lesson in the devastating human and financial cost of ego-driven policing. Sarah used a portion of the settlement to establish a scholarship fund at the college for students committed to social justice and public service. It was her way of creating something positive from the wreckage, of turning her pain into someone else's opportunity. Though she had won, though she had been proven right, she knew that a part of her had been irrevocably broken that day. The scar remained, a reminder of her vulnerability, of how quickly a life could be dismantled by a lie and an abuse of power. The verdict was justice, but her quiet moments of peace were the true signs of her victory. In the quiet aftermath, when the lawyer's calls ceased and the media's attention faded, Sarah found herself reflecting not with anger, but with a profound and weary sadness. She thought of Mark Thorne. What created a man so certain of his own judgment, so dismissive of another's humanity? Perhaps he was driven by a deep-seated insecurity, a need to constantly perform his authority to convince himself of its legitimacy. In his world of black and white, A respected professor in her intellectual sanctuary represented a gray area he couldn't comprehend. So he painted it black with the broadest brush he had. Had someone, a supervisor or a mentor, intervened early in his career, perhaps after the first or second complaint, and forced him to confront the chasm between procedure and his ego, maybe this catastrophe could have been averted. His downfall wasn't a single act, but the culmination of 1,000 small failures by a system that chose to look away. And what of Olivia Morgan, a young woman so consumed by her own sense of grievance that she was willing to burn down another's life to soothe her own wounded pride? If only she had possessed the maturity to accept her own failure, to learn from it rather than assign blame. If only she could have seen Professor Jenkins not as an obstacle, but as someone trying to teach her a lesson that went far beyond literature, a lesson about integrity. Sarah also considered her own path. What if she had been less defiant, more compliant in those first moments? Would it have changed the outcome? She thought not. Thorne had arrived with a script already written. Her role was precast as the villain. Her only defense, her only true shield, was the unwavering truth and the accidental presence of so many digital witnesses. Her ordeal became a stark lesson. In an age where a lie can circle the globe before the truth can get its boots on, objective, recorded evidence is not a luxury, but a necessity for self-preservation. The story of Sarah Jenkins is not just about a verdict or a sum of money. It is a testament to the resilience of one woman and a searing reminder of the fragility of reputation. It teaches us that integrity is the only shield that truly endures, and that accountability, no matter how delayed, is the essential cornerstone of a just society. It reminds us that the duty to intervene in the face of injustice belongs not just to the person in uniform, but to all of us. What does true accountability look like to you? Have you ever witnessed a small injustice and wished you had spoken up? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, because these conversations are how we begin to build a better, more just world.